Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Dangerous Rhetoric. This is episode 96. I'm Brentley.
I'm Dan.
And today, before I forget, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do all the things, give us money. There's links in the description. I love you. Thank you so much. Today, we are having a wonderful conversation about homosexuality and Christianity with Miss Gothix. She's right here.
Hello.
A scripter extraordinaire, very popular. Thrice canceled now, I believe.
I lost count, but we can go with, I like thrice. It sounds nice.
Thrice canceled.
Problematic
and
thinker.
Below me, Miss Keri Smith from Deprogrammed.
Hello, guys.
Yes.
Hello, Gothix. Good to see you.
Thank you, guys.
Both of you guys have...
Can I pay you the compliment I did before we started?
Oh, please do.
That you look like a CoverGirl ad because your lighting's so nice.
Your lighting is great, Gothix.
Thank you.
Perfect lighting.
I really appreciate that, but unfortunately, I cannot be on CoverGirl because there are only men on CoverGirl.
She said, get my good angle. I'm like, every angle is good. What are you talking about? We already have the best angle. Yeah, so you guys have both been on the show before. Gothix, you were on actually recently, last November, and Keri, it's been a while. You were on last March, I believe it was.
Oh, time flies though when you get this old.
Yeah. It was right before Brett and I came back to New York from Florida, so I do remember.
Okay.
It was around that time. I think you were like the last episode we shot before we were like, all right, let's go back to the city. Yeah, but thanks for joining us again. We appreciate you guys giving us your time. And I think this is the first episode we've done where we've had like two separate previous guests together in one episode to have a discussion. So that's a first.
Well, you picked the best guest, so I mean,
yes.
Kudos to you guys.
We got good taste.
Well, the reason we wanted to talk to you ladies was because you are both out and loud and proud Christians, and you talk about your faith. You know, Gothix, you've come to it, within the last year or two. Keri, you've gotten more involved over time, but really, again, it's been more of a recent phenomenon in the last couple of years.
You're also both disaffected liberals. You guys are people who came from the more lefty liberal political perspective and then have changed your views within the last few years. And I know Keri was very deep in that world, especially, and you worked in what, theater? I forget.
No, I represented comedians.
Okay,
in Los Angeles, right?
Yeah,
and New York for 1 year.
Yeah, so woke central and woke central.
So let me just ask you, ladies, how were you always of faith, or were you atheist, or just give like a brief little description of where you're at and where you came from. You want to go first, Gothix?
Yeah, so I would say high school, maybe my younger childhood years, I was Wiccan, which is like a witch. And then after, when I got into my 20s, I was agnostic, which is, not confirming or denying the existence of God, not quite atheist. Earlier last year, I became a Christian. So for the most part, I've just been a mixture of believing in other things aside from God.
Cool. Miss Keri?
I was raised Southern Baptist, or in a Southern Baptist church. And I kind of walked away from that. It took a period of years, like 2 or 3 years, but started walking away from that when I was around 15. I went to a science and math high school. You live there. It's a state-funded school. You have to get in. Like, they have these in some of the states with the worst education systems, frankly. So South Carolina has one. It's called the School for Science and Math, and they took at the time, I think it was like 90 students. Anyway, the point is, when I got to this school, it was my first time outside of my little bubble, my small town. And then I started, I guess I would say my mind was open to, well, this is the only belief system I've known and the life I've known. And I have reason to doubt it because I had people in my life who were hypocrites. And so I mistakenly at that age took that to mean maybe that's a reflection of the belief system itself, right? And those are representations of what Christians are like. And so starting at the science and math school and then continuing at college, I started walking away from that. And then I was agnostic. I called myself agnostic for like 20 years, but truly I became very bigoted towards Christians. I was very prejudiced towards Christians, and my religion became woke. And so when I started leaving woke around 2016, it was similarly like a 2 or 3 year process. I found myself searching for meaning, like for answers, like the big picture questions, like why are we here? And what are we? And do we have a soul? And so that led me down this path. I never thought I would become a Christian, but that's where I am now. And that was a long process. So
Your little summary, and then
So mine is kind of maybe like a combo of both of you guys in a sense. I was raised Catholic through my life. You know, I went to church for a while, and around the same age as Keri, 15, was when I started to break away from that. And then I would say maybe around 16, I had a bit of like an atheist phase going through high school, where I was just like, yeah, I don't believe in any of this. I was reading Richard Dawkins and that sort of thing, you know, and that whole new atheist wave. I kind of started reading some of that stuff, Christopher Hitchens, and I do think they do make some valid points and criticisms still against institutions of religion. But overall, I eventually came to realize that atheism was also a belief system, that they were very adamant about not believing in God, which was also something they couldn't prove, just as they would argue that we couldn't prove the existence of God. And then over time, I went back, but sort of like, I guess from a spiritual perspective, I wasn't Wiccan, but I always had a fascination with symbolism, which I still do. It's one of the subjects I like to study: symbolism, mythology, and iconography, those sorts of things. And I always found the greatest contribution to society and culture that religion ever contributed was art. And, you know, like things like Gothic cathedrals and those sorts of things, like there was something very deep and spiritual about those creations. So that was kind of, I guess, what brought me back in that direction. And now I guess I consider myself like a sort of non-denominational, like Christian mystic, you know, like an esoteric Christian or something. I don't really subscribe to a specific church. And, you know, I've been to Catholic masses, obviously. I've been to a Protestant mass before, too, which is quite similar. They don't call it a mass either. They call it a service. So use a different word for that. But I don't know. I mean, I think there is definitely more that indicates God is real than there is indicating otherwise. And that's kind of where I am now. But being homosexual and that whole experience was one of the reasons I broke away in the first place. And it's why a lot of people like me do end up breaking away from religion, because we feel like we don't fit into it in some way, and we're looking for answers.
Yeah, so then my experience was I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic elementary school. I was really good at religion until puberty, and I realized I had a little inkling of attraction for other boys. And then I started to poke around to figure out what that meant in my, Catholic church at the time's system of belief. And this was in the, like the late 90s. And that was kind of like really before, culture had changed. Now culture shift. It's really hard for young people, especially, to understand what growing up in the 80s and 90s was like with, if you're homosexual or even just generally like a little weird or outside the norm. There was still that sort of like, the 20th century sense of conforming to the group cultural, whatever was expected of you. And that really didn't change until, around like the 21st century. But anyway, so once I realized I was gay, I was like, well, this religious system can't be right. Whatever they're saying here, this book, these people, they're all wrong, because this is the way God made me. So, I guess God, either he doesn't exist or, there's something really weird going on here. So I was an atheist from like puberty till about college. And in college, I took 2 hits of LSD and had what's called a peak experience. And I sort of like lost touch with my body, slipped through the wormhole, and, went into the vastness of space and time and had contact with what I perceived to be a higher non-corporeal form of benevolent intelligence that sort of is at the center of everything and touches everything and is everything. You could call it God. And I was like, well, okay. So I wouldn't call myself a believer, as more of an experiencer or somebody who like, it's not that I believe God exists, it's that I know it does because I've seen it. And, it's that's a unique experience that you can only get that through intense meditation or the use of psychedelics. So I don't know what to tell people, but I consider myself like a paleo Christian or a mystic or an esoteric. I'm technically in the church, the Fellowship of the Divine Cosmic Mind, which is a wonderful group of contrarian thinkers who lean Christian. That I joined years ago.
Value-wise, although they also do a lot of historical analysis of the Bible and that sort of
fun people.
Yeah. But I guess I wanted to also ask, what do you guys think of Jordan Peterson's response to this question? Do you believe in God? Because he gets a lot of praise from both sides, really. Atheists love his biblical lectures because they feel like they've been able to, I guess, look at those stories and find value in them as non-believers now in the way that he looks at them from a psychological lens. But obviously Christians appreciate that too, but they also give him shit because he won't outright just say like God exists or I believe in that. His response is typically, I behave as if God exists.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't remember what passage it is, but in the Bible, I'm pretty sure it talks about like if you believe in God, you'll be able to profess it with no problems. And what I think is going on is he understands that he has such a core viewer base of non-believers that if he were to even mention God, they would probably discredit him, which I can totally get because I see the same thing in my videos. Like anytime I mention God, gotta click off. Everything you've said up until this point is invalidated. So I understand that fear, and for me, what it looks like is like he's wrestling with that. But I really do think he's on the right path. I think it's just taking that final leap of faith.
I similarly, I think he's I don't know, I think God is using him to great effect, regardless of what he believes, because he's one of the people who first opened my eyes to some of the stuff that was wrong in my old belief system.
Yeah, you had a bit of a communication with him, right, when you first started to leave the woke.
Yeah, so and yeah, he ended up reading the letter I sent him on his YouTube channel at the time. And he wrote me and told me I had to get over my fear, which took me about 6 more months. Just my fear of leaving the woke. We weren't talking about God or anything.
Yeah.
But I continued watching his stuff, and his biblical series was eye-opening to me. And like you said, I think a lot of people who are not believers really came to appreciate the Bible more just through listening to him talk about it and open their mind a little. I think he has led a lot of people to God, with whether or not that's his intention. He's like the gateway drug to God. Like he's like the bridge.
He single-handedly restored my interest in the Bible.
Yeah. I think he understands that the West is built on a particular moral framework that comes from those stories. And I think that's the main reason he says I behave as if God exists, because he even argues that, look, many atheists also behave as if God exists, even if they won't admit it. And I think we discussed this before, Keri, on your channel.
And there are Christians or people who claim to be Christian who actually behave as if God doesn't exist.
Very good point.
They are practical atheists. They just say they're Christians. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think he might be, I haven't listened to his videos very recently, so I'm not sure where he's at right now, but I think he's still on a path and towards truth. And last I was watching him, it seemed to be the case. And I think what you were kind of saying, Gothix, he makes me think of that Bible verse where the guy falls down at Jesus's feet and says, I believe, help me with my unbelief. And that's a prayer that my pastor talks about sometimes, that you can say that prayer, because at one point my pastor was not a believer, but he wanted to believe. And I actually have come to meet a lot of atheists in the past couple of years who've told me, I just don't have that belief in this deity. And I find that really hard to make that jump, but I want to. I wish I had that belief. And it's like, well, then just try saying that prayer. I believe, help me with my unbelief.
It's in Mark 9:24.
Mark 9:24, apparently.
Yeah, he Peterson had a great three-way discussion on his channel that was really interesting. It was between him, Jonathan Pajot, who is a Christian, and he's an artist. He carves icons for, I think, the Orthodox Church, and Douglas Murray, who's an atheist. And the three of them had a very interesting discussion about all of this, because even Douglas, as someone who's an atheist, is kind of struggling a bit, because on one end, yeah, he's a non-believer, and for many years he was, up until like his 20s, and then he left the church. But on the other end, he has to acknowledge the foundational importance of the biblical stories and of Christian belief, even to the point where that stuff led to the Enlightenment, which cast it off. But there would have been no Enlightenment if you didn't have these mystical sort of scientists, because that's what they were. Like, alchemists were mystical scientists. They were Christians, but they were also scientists. Like, the way they viewed things was discovering more about the universe and matter and how the physical universe operates was a spiritual pursuit. It wasn't something that they separated. And that happened later during the Enlightenment, where the two sort of separated. And now you have this, this constant argument that science and religion oppose each other. But I don't think that's true at all. I think, any pursuit of understanding the physical universe better is also a pursuit of understanding God and God's creation.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and I think the question is, are you in pursuit of truth, or are you in pursuit of an agenda? Because there are many scientists and there are many religious leaders that are in pursuit of agendas and not the truth. And this is like, what creates the big conflict, generally speaking, between different factions in the culture war, is that, one side is lying in exact opposition of the truth, like complete opposite of the truth. And the other side is actually trying to get at it, it's trying to approach it through a variety of means, mostly through debate and discussion and presenting of evidence and then challenging. So it's interesting, where we're sort of at this point now where you would think that, culturally, the atheists tend to have the most power. Because they're the ones generating, the content, when it comes to stories and media and stuff like that. But we've been seeing a new resurgence on the right of more religious ideas and religious institutions. And, now with like companies like the Daily Wire, they're putting out content that is more religious in nature. So it's like the culture is asking for that.
Well, I think, so we had a conversation on my channel. It was me and my pastor, and then James Lindsay, who's an atheist.
It's a great conversation.
That was a great talk.
Someone told me recently he says he's agnostic now, which is huge. I haven't confirmed that, but
really interesting.
Somebody was like, "Yeah, I heard him say that recently." Anyway, whether or not he said that, in that conversation, he was coming from the atheist perspective, but he was saying he was almost in complete agreement with my pastor and everything. And he was like, this is not just a cultural war, this is a spiritual war. And he's been saying that a lot. And I think some people who are atheists understand intuitively what he means. And then there are others who are like, what are you talking about? Are you becoming a woo-woo Christian now or whatever? They don't get it. But
I think people like him, even though they're atheists, having fought against the very godless side of the radical left, are realizing something. And I think it's that, religion gives us a foundation of discipline. And that's one of the things that I've found valuable about having a religious perspective, because that's what I need in my life. That's what I needed more of. And that's what I wish other people taught me, who were my mentors, were like, you're not a victim all the time. You don't have to feel perpetually disenfranchised. Get your shit together, be more responsible, discipline yourself. And it's kind of hard to do that if you don't have a strong foundation in something. And I think we talked about this with Gothix in our last episode, that what's a stronger foundation than God, than this unifying principle, this thing that all things come from and are within. That's like the most, like, it's always there. You can always come back to that when all these other things could fall away. Your relationships could fall apart. People in your life are going to die. Like, your life can't revolve around those things. It has to revolve around something that is an eternal sort of foundation, which always keeps you oriented toward bettering yourself. And people need that. They need that message. Is why Peterson, I think, became as popular as he did, because so many young people, and especially young men, were feeling lost, were feeling without purpose. And we're raised in this sort of coddling culture where we're being told, no, you're fine the way you are. But at the same time, they're being told men are toxic, men are evil, all this other stuff. And it's just like, they need to be told, like, actually, no, maybe you're not fine the way you are. Maybe you could be better. Maybe you're not maximizing your potential or living up to your full potential. Maybe there are things that you're avoiding and things that you lie to yourself about. And I think that's why, you know, at the same time, people like Peterson, that message is becoming more popular. It's the same reason I think more people are turning towards religion as well, because they're looking for that foundation. They're looking for something to tell them, like, get your shit together. They're tired of being told you're perfect the way you are. It's not a healthy message.
And also it provides standards too, because
Yes.
our culture is so infatuated with this idea that you can just do whatever you want.
Don't judge me. Don't judge me. No judging zone. No judgments. Don't judge.
Yeah, I was talking to my friend the other day about, like, you know, we have Pride Month. I'm like, we should have Shame Month. Like, let's bring shame in.
Yeah.
Like, let's start shaming shit. Like, let's stop avoiding that. Maybe we should judge. Absolutely.
Yeah, pride
I'm
is a
sorry.
deadly sin.
I interrupted you. Gothix.
That's okay. No, I was loving that. I just want a whole segment of you doing whatever that was.
No, but I was just thinking, you know, I too had this, you know, how dare I form moral or personal judgments about the behavior of other people, you know, program that was just, I guess it's because I was more active in gay culture in New York City and nightlife. And those are places where you really don't want people to make judgments about your behavior because they will not be flattering, let me tell you. But that's what I had it in there. And then, you know, over time, I just sort of realized it was in there. And I was like, you know, this is sort of the antithesis of what I do as a critical thinker. Like, critical thinking involves making value judgments and discerning, you know, positive, negatives of certain things and honestly listing them and then comparing and then being like, what's the course of action that's most beneficial? So judgment is a vital and necessary part of the human experience. And yet we are commanded, you know, the Bible says, judge not lest ye be judged. But at the same time, I don't think it's talking about making those kind of decisions. I think it's being more like what we would have considered the racism of the 20th century or homophobia of the 20th century, you know, those kind of judgments where you're making these wide sweeping judgments about an entire group of people based on a superficial characteristic that they happen to share, instead of being more individualistic and, you know, based on, you know, people's your individual relationship with someone. But
yeah, so I guess this kind of leads into the main topic that we wanted to discuss.
Oh yeah, the gays.
Yeah, and it's like, how can one be homosexual and still be a good Christian? And is that possible? Because this is something I've wrestled with my entire life, and I think most people who are raised religious who are like me have also wrestled with this, and a lot of us never come back to God. Whereas I very much am someone who has come back to God, but it's a little unfair. And one of the things I find I can't get a lot of Christians to kind of just outright say, because they dance around it, but it sounds like that's what they're saying is, you know, they'll say things like hate the sin, but not the sinner, et cetera, which I agree with that perspective. But I feel like what they're trying to say is people like me should not have romantic loving relationships, that we should remain celibate, and that the only way we can really be good Christians and avoid sin and devote ourselves to God is we must only devote ourselves to God, that we can't have a loving, lasting relationship with another person because, or even worse, some of them will say, well, just suck it up and be with a woman. And that's complicated too, because that wouldn't be fair to the woman. And that's kind of my view on that. Like, if I could have forced myself to be with a woman, I would have done that already. You know, that's what I would have.
And I thought I would just pull up the infamous Leviticus 20:13. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Yeah. And Leviticus 18:22. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination.
There's a name for all these verses too. What do they call them again? There's like a.
What do you mean?
There's like a specific term that they use for those verses specifically.
The
collectively.
The bad gay verses?
No, it's not the bad gay.
Bad gays, bad.
Let me see.
I mean, I get it. But the thing is, I have this feeling that, I don't know about you ladies, and maybe we can discuss this point individually, but do you feel that the Bible is the unerring divine word of God? Because for me, I know that it was written down by men and retranslated hundreds, if not thousands of times over, thousands of years. So while I think it does contain the spirit of the, divine inspiration, clearly, I don't think some of the specifics are necessarily all going to be, I don't think we can take it as the unerring word of everything. And yes, I do think there is value in culturally condemning homosexuality en masse, because, too much of it, it's like the spice of life. Too much is a bad thing. When we get drag kids and, gender bending out the wazoo, and now they're trying to gender bend the children. So I think there's a good argument to be made that too much homosexuality in the culture is negative. It negatively impacts the culture, and especially the children, which is kind of what they were saying in the 20th century. And we were like, no, we don't want anything to do with the kids. We're just trying to have our own adult spaces. And now it's like 20 years later, and I'm like, what? Yeah.
So I believe in the Bible as it is, because I think also there is a slippery slope to saying that, some things in the Bible maybe aren't supposed to be taken, or maybe there's something off with some of these verses, because if that's the case, then we can say that about the entirety of the gospel. Like, can we truly trust that Jesus was actually sent here? Like,
really quick though, the clobber verses.
The clobber?
That's what
I never heard that word.
Never heard that?
Yeah.
So either.
Yeah, they're called the clobber verses, and those are the passages in the Bible that deal with homosexuality.
Yeah. But yeah, that, as far as like the Bible, that's, I would say the whole thing. Otherwise, we'd have to question what else is not true in it. And the thing with, I can see why from a secular, non-religious standpoint of why they emphasize why homosexuality is a sin. It's because, well, if you look at culture, right, or just look at society, we know what the function of procreation is. So if you move away from that, what the design was intended, I think inevitably you're going to end up where people continue breaking standards, because we've already broken that first standard of men and women. And so I can see why now we have Drag Queen Story Hour and all that other stuff.
No, I don't think you're far off in that either. I do think there is something to that argument, but like it or not, like, I exist, like I'm here, and sure. I don't know why I am the way I am. I don't know how much of it has to do with nurture, how much of it has to do with nature. That debate is very much still up in the air. So, when people say like, oh, we're born this way, that's not 100% certain either. And it's really controversial to say that as a gay man amongst others, because a lot of them very much hold on to that idea that they are born this way and that there was nothing that caused us to be this way. But the point is, we are this way. And we didn't choose it. And there are still many Christians that I talk to who seem to still hold this idea that we have chosen to be this way. And they'll go as far as to say like, oh, well, it's fine to have same-sex attraction, but you can't act on it. That's when it's a sin.
So, about the verses from Leviticus. So I sometimes feel like these discussions are best had with the pastor, because I am not a pastor. I will tell you my evolving understanding.
Yes.
Is that I believe, like you do, Gothix, it is the word of God. And I think it's a slippery slope to start saying, and I think it's prideful. It would be prideful for me as a human to say, God, I'm with you, but not this. I think, that's a little extreme. And like, I saw this meme the other day that's like, the meme said, a pastor reads from Bible, progressive Christian. Well, that's a bit extreme, which I thought was funny. But anyway, Jesus came in the New Testament is the new covenant. My pastor said something once that I'm still thinking about what it means and how to do it. But he was saying that the Old Testament has to be viewed through the lens of the New Testament. The New Testament is the lens through which to read the Old, and that Jesus came and made the ultimate sacrifice so that we didn't have to live by the Old Covenant, which didn't suffice anyway. So in the Old Testament, you also see things about not eating shellfish, and pork, and how you have to kill, like you said, kill different type. Well, kill this kind of sinner, and kill this kind of sinner, and kill this kind of sinner, and make this kind of sacrifice this animal, and stone this person.
Old
And
Testament God was very mad.
right. And the thing is, like, as a sinner, I believe coming to God requires the humbleness and brokenness of being like, I am broken, like, and I deserve death for my sins. I do. If God is just, and God is just, but see, God is both at once, which we can't really fully wrap our heads around. He is just, but he's also loving. And so when Jesus is the loving, that's the loving part. It's like he made that ultimate sacrifice so that I don't have to die for my sins, that I am forgiven by the sacrifice of God's Son. And he took that upon himself, like knowing that's what was to come. He allowed it to happen. There's a song about I forget the words, but it's like, he could have called 10,000 angels while he's on the cross. He could have called 10,000 angels and gotten down off the cross, and he did not. That self-sacrificing thing, that ultimate act of sacrifice, it's like changes everything. And so this is the way I'm coming to understand how I'm supposed to interpret the Old Testament, is through the new covenant and through Jesus coming and showing a new way. And I'm still learning what that means, but I think I'm on the right path of understanding how to better interpret the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament.
Are you guys familiar with the passage in Matthew about eunuchs?
I'm not sure.
Okay, this is something I wanted to bring up because
send me that link?
It's something I came across a while ago when I was searching for answers, probably back in college. All right, hold on, Brent. I'm like in the middle of talking. I'm sorry, I didn't plan this out to send you the link. I'm just gonna read from it.
Okay,
but
just read it.
So basically, in this section, Jesus is having a discussion with the apostles about marriage and about divorce, and is it ever appropriate to divorce? Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? And Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery. Jesus' disciples were nervous at his teaching. In fact, since Jesus made divorce much more difficult to attain than Moses did, they wondered aloud if marriage was such a good thing after all. And quote, if this is a situation between a husband and wife, is it better not to marry? They ask him. This is Matthew 19:10. Like many people today, the disciples thought the fidelity and permanence taught by Jesus might be too difficult for anyone to follow. To the skepticism of the disciples, Jesus responded, this is what he said, and it's a really weird verse, and a lot of people interpret it in different ways. He said, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way. Others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. And by this response, what he's saying is, here are three categories of people who should not marry a woman at all. Just avoid it. Don't even go down that path, because it's not going to work. And typically in the modern times, when we hear the word eunuch, we're thinking of a castrated male, of someone who had their, genitals removed, or at least their, testicles, and therefore can't please a woman, right, sexually or procreate. Therefore, that person should clearly not marry a woman. But he's naming three types of eunuchs here. Like, he's defining that word in three different ways. And one of those definitions includes that definition I just said. So the other two are something else. Like, what is a eunuch who is born that way? And if it's like, say, like an intersex person or something like that, I feel like that would be so uncommon that he probably wouldn't name it at all. But, and then clearly there's those who have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven, right? That's someone who took a vow to the church, so a priest. And then the other is those who were made that way by men. That's what we define as a eunuch now, someone who was, snipped. But what is a eunuch that is born that way? And from what it sounds like is like he's describing a man who was born without the ability to have sex with a woman, whatever that might imply. People interpret this verse differently. I don't know. I think it's one of those mysterious parts of the Bible that are really hard to kind of wrap your head around.
Well, actually, I don't interpret it exactly the way you do. Speaking of people interpreting it differently, I think, like when I first, as you were reading this, I pulled it up, and that's interesting. You read it that way because my gut reaction was to understand the eunuchs who were born that way as people who were born intersex or without genitalia or something. Maybe I'm wrong.
I feel like that would be so rare, though, that it wouldn't necessarily be something that would even be included, but it could be.
Right. And then eunuchs who've been made eunuchs by others, we agree on what that means.
Yeah.
Someone who's been castrated. And then those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Well, this gets to your question about, do Christians believe about, like, should gay people be celibate? So I have a friend who, I've been thinking about this a lot too. I have a friend who is trans, who is also devout.
Is this Sarah Higdon?
No.
Yeah. Sarah Higdon's a Catholic, so.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I did know that.
Yeah.
No, this is someone who's not like a public person. And he told me, so female to male, that that he's going to be celibate for life. And I haven't really had the chance to talk more about that and wasn't going to push at the time, but it's like, I wonder if that's because of religious conviction or for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, or maybe my friend feels that whoever it is he's attracted to is like a sin, and so he's going to be celibate for that reason. That's how I interpret that verse, is people who have chosen for whatever reason to forego sexual relations.
Yeah.
Maybe also it means people who have attraction to children, who are like, I'm not going to have sex because my attraction is wrong.
I don't know if eunuch would include that definition, though.
Well, so
No, but
that's
choose to live like eunuchs.
Yeah.
There's
Like
also
live like, meaning not have
there's
sex,
some-
right?
Yeah, we had a recent guest on, Basil, who's Muslim, and he considers himself a reformed sodomite. He is a homosexual. He identifies that way, but he's also voluntarily celibate for those reasons as well, because he's not trying to reinterpret the Quran to say, oh, what I'm doing is correct. You know, he's trying to follow it for the way that it was written. So
yeah. So, I don't know. What do you think, Vanessa?
I mean, I'm kind of on the same board here with Keri, I think. I was actually trying to look up. It's funny. I was listening to a podcast the other day of some gay guy that found God, and he wrote a book on his journey, and basically said that, and this is something that I find common, is a lot of gay guys that find Christ end up willingly being celibate, or sometimes they end up having their minds changed by God and their heart changed and everything. Hold on. I hear lots of noise.
That's
sorry,
New York.
hold on.
Yeah, sorry.
Is that you guys?
That's
Yeah,
us.
that's us.
That's Hell's Kitchen.
Are they okay? But what was I gonna say? Yeah, so I think the question that I would have for anyone that is gay and trying to have a relationship with God, because whenever I hear talk about this conversation, it's usually like, well, should I be celibate the rest of my life? Like, why should I be? And I think that question in itself is I think it might be maybe an indicator of maybe a deeper relationship needs to be built with Christ, because if you're living for Christ, then it shouldn't even be a matter of why am I going to be single? Why do I have to be celibate? It's I love my Lord and I want to serve my Lord, so it doesn't even faze me. I could even take it a step further and say, like, okay, if we're looking at it from the perspective of self-denial, everyone's got to pick up their cross and follow Jesus. So why is it in that context? I see a lot of people that say, you know, I am a gay Christian, I'm married to a guy, I still have sex with this guy. Are they truly denying their flesh as if, you know, as they would be expected? Does that make sense?
I mean, it does, but at the same time, it's easy to say that from your perspective and from where you are, because, you know, you're married, right? You have a husband.
Sure.
I don't know if you view all the sex that you have with your husband as only having the end goal of procreating. I imagine a lot of that has to do with bonding as well.
Oh, that's not the end. Just to clarify, that's the function.
That's the function, but
function.
I don't think it is the only function of sex between people. I think sex is also a deep spiritual bonding activity between people. And I've had that with men, where it wasn't this animalistic carnal thing. It was a deep thing that bonded the two of us together on a deep level. And I think that is something that is possible between two men and two women. I think falling into promiscuity is wrong, no matter if you're gay or straight. I think just viewing people as objects to pleasure yourself with is the wrong way to approach sex. And I do also agree that
I'm in trouble.
I do also agree that a lot of gay and lesbian and bisexual people approach sex in that way, perhaps more so than heterosexuals do, and that's kind of that is an issue, you know, especially gay men, because men are more sexual and they're less likely to say no to sex, whereas women are more selective when it comes to that. So if you throw a whole bunch of men together who like to have sex with each other, they're less likely to say no. They're going to end up having more throwaway, promiscuous, objectifying sex. And that is an issue. And that isn't something I think we should normalize as society. But I also think it's possible for two men to have a very deep bond, and that this can be part of that bond. So, you know, to say that if you want to have your relationship with Christ, you have to view that bond as something evil is a really hard thing to contend with. Like, what if I told you that your bond with your husband, if any sex you had has no end goal of procreating, that's an evil thing, even though it doesn't feel that way.
it only has the goal of procreating.
Yeah,
it is a sexual. It is a pleasurable thing, a gift that he's given us.
Sure.
I think you're coming from a place of trying to say that.
When I brought that up, I was trying to argue it away from God, because whenever people, if the conversation is, okay, is homosexuality normal and natural, we can just take God out of the picture and just look at nature.
Yeah.
And that's why I bring up procreation. Like, obviously you get pleasure out of it.
Yeah. Well,
But
I think normal is a different thing than natural. I think it is natural, because I don't think it would exist if it wasn't natural. That would be like saying God made a mistake and having anyone have a natural inclination in that direction. But normal, yes, it is not normal, and it shouldn't be. It's not supposed to be. And when people hear the word normal and abnormal, they attach a positive and a negative to this, when all normal means is the most common thing, and all abnormal means is a less or least common thing. That's it. Yes, I have an abnormal sexuality. It's not supposed to be normal. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. If it were the norm, you know, society wouldn't spread and humans wouldn't procreate. So yes, it is abnormal. It's not normal. But natural, that's a different question, I think. Brent, I feel like you want to weigh in here.
Well, I was thinking about, you know, I don't think you can use either as a standard to judge moral value, because just because something is natural doesn't mean it's morally good, because we can look to how brutal nature is in many examples, and things like incest and pedophilia happens all the time in nature. So clearly
that's a good point.
It's not good. But there is something about, you know, the human relationships are so mumuch different, and we're called to, you know, treat each other how we would want to be treated. So I have a hard time with any sort of value judgment on like homosexual behavior in general, as opposed to in specific when it comes to things like excesses or fetish, or, you know, public, you know, things that influence the children.
Yes.
So I don't think, like I said, God, I'm gay. I realized I was gay in puberty, whether that's from a failing or of my parents to do something, or a genetic switch. Like that's the way that the universe has plopped me here. So I'm obviously gay for a reason. There's other gay people for a reason.
Yeah. Well, another thing I wanted to bring up too is like, family values. Like, well, yes, a lot of the lefty LGBTQ, or for the most part, that entire movement throws that shit out the window. And I think that is why we're seeing the backlash we're seeing against it, because family values are important. But gay people have families. We are part of families. I think we serve a particular role in families. A lot of us are uncles and aunts, and we help raise kids in that capacity, even if we can't have our own kids. So, it's possible to be gay and lesbian and to have family values, and even to promote traditional family values, and to say traditional family values are for the best. And that is something that we should promote as a good, not as something that is negative, because, like, say, we are not capable of having that traditional family. Just because we're not capable of having it doesn't mean that it isn't something that is generally good for society that we should promote. And that's kind of where I fall into all of this stuff, because I do think that stuff is good. I do value traditional family. I would like to promote more of it and less of the debauchery that we find from people like me. But also, there are people like me who think that sex can be something that is sacred between same-sex people. Maybe it's not as common. Maybe it doesn't have the end goal of bringing a child into the world, but it's the same with a barren marriage.
I think, well, first of all, anyone that believes Jesus died on the cross and actually believes in him is going to be saved. So I think I have to start there, because I think the problem with this conversation is that it's sort of like, okay, so if you truly believe in Jesus, you're saved, right? So we got that. But it's almost as if you are normalizing the sin, which we wouldn't do with any other sin either, right? Like, we wouldn't say, hey, it's totally fine to be drunk all the time. Go have at it. You know what I mean? So it's sort of like, and I can see why a lot of churches have been so perverted, and I think it's that slippery slope where we say, okay, let's normalize this particular sin is okay, and it's like, where do you draw the line there? And this isn't to say, like, once you turn to Christ, you're not going to struggle with a particular sin. I'm still sinning all the time, but I think it's when you choose to lie there and say, no, actually, I think this is okay, and that's something that you or anyone else who's in that predicament would have to answer for. I put up a few passages I wanted to read to you guys really quickly, just to pick your brain and see what you think about this, if you don't mind.
No, go for it.
All right. So I got one here from Romans 8:5, and it reads, "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on things of the Spirit. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For the mind that is set on flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God." And there was also another one that said, this was quoted in one of my videos that I did, 1 Corinthians 10:23.
Yeah, these are all Paul's letters.
I have the right to do everything. Not everything is beneficial, but I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive.
Yeah, we talked about that on the last episode you were on in regards to smoking weed.
Yeah.
I think you're sort of hitting on like where my mind is at on it, because I was waiting for a specific question, but I'll just try and
just jump in.
Just go, girl. The mic is yours.
I was like, if they ask me, so first of all, let's go back to that phrase about like hate the sin, not the sinner. When I was a very anti-Christian, sort of agnostic, this was just me. I didn't understand that verse. There's been lots of things I think I understand better now. I'm not saying that's what you are. I'm just saying that I never understood that verse until recently. And now I understand when people say that. I think I understand what they mean, because I feel called to do that. And our culture, we are coming from a place where we are so like post-Christianity culturally that a lot of things that the Bible says are sins, we don't view culturally as there being anything wrong with those things, like being a drunkard or having an abortion or having sex outside of marriage. I mean, when you said, Daniel, people, my people doing, debauchery or whatever, I was thinking, what, like all people, like straight people do tons of debauchery?
No, well, I was definitely referring in general to that way of approaching sex, which I do think is not healthy, is not good.
Right, and straight people do that too.
And it's bleeding its
straight
blood over
do
into
that
the straight
too.
population.
But I think
it didn't come from gay people. That's
gay men do it more, though. I think there is something to
because they're men.
Because they're men. Yeah.
There's no break. There's only gas.
Yes.
But anyway, the point is that coming to Christianity as I did, as someone who's coming from the culture and was inoculated against Christianity in some respects, my inclination is not. We're not in a cultural place where homophobia is the norm, where people grow up with. I just don't believe that. I don't believe people are like, oh, there's something wrong with gay people. In fact, it's the opposite. And it's my natural inclination, my human nature and my flesh is to say, I love my friends who are gay, which I do, and therefore I don't want to say something that causes them pain, that I believe this. However, I also believe God convicts me to speak the truth. And so if someone asks me, I have had this awkward conversation once before off camera with a friend who's gay and a friend who was straight, and we were talking about it. And it's like, yeah, if you ask me directly, do I think the Bible says that being homosexuality is a sin? I do. I also think it says being a drunkard is a sin, and sex before marriage is a sin. But I don't spend a lot of time thinking about homosexuality because, as you said, it's easy for me because that in regards to this question, because that's not my thorn.
Yeah. Well,
I have thought about my thorns, and so that's why I try and compare it to what mine are so I can understand better what would I do if that were the situation I was in. I think God would call me. Here's what happened to me. God convicted me about my sins. And as broken people and as Christians, like once you're you've been born again, you're still going to have sins. You're still going to struggle with sins. But I do believe you're going to be so compelled like that you can't live in one, that you can't make one okay, like, and say, well, it's okay that I do this one. I think that you will struggle with it. I think as you mentioned, there are a lot of gay Christians who struggle with it and some who've chosen celibacy. I think I would struggle with it if I were gay. I struggled with sex before marriage. I struggled with drinking, smoking, things that for me I know are me living in sin. And so let's just take the one I can compare it to, sex before marriage. When I first became a Christian and I was going every week, I was going to different churches and stuff. My experience was that the Holy Spirit convicted me. I didn't want to be convicted. I was like, but it's good enough that I believe in you. Like, this is amazing that I even believe in you. Why do I'm not going to pay attention to this or this, right? But I couldn't not pay attention to it because I'm telling you, God has this way of like, every time I opened the Bible, it was on the same verses. I would go to the church and he'd be telling the same verses. I would seriously open it to a random page and it was about my sexual immorality. And I was dating a guy at the time and we were already having sex. And I had to have that conversation with him and be like, he's hounding me and I'm not going to be able to have sex with you anymore. Yeah. And he was like, bullshit, like you just,
See,
there's some other reason. And I think it's different. Yes. Because it is who you love. It's not with that.
Well, it's different because
right.
there was still a path open to you, marriage,
I
with
agree.
which you can have sex that is no longer considered a sin. Whereas for people like us, there is no path open to us according to the scripture, and that no matter how much we love the person that we're devoted to, and even if we marry them, we have to look at that love as something evil and degenerate and sinful. And that's simply something that I can't accept. I don't view the love that I've had for men as sinful. Maybe some of the sex I've had was carnal, but I don't view all of it that way at all. I think, like I said, I've had deep spiritual experiences from that with men.
Well, and as a Christian, I don't try and convince you any differently. And I would not, like, I don't, that's why this is a conversation that's usually initiated by someone asking me, because, I mean, like I said, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Like, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah, you don't have to.
I know I don't, but I'm not going to feel guilty about that either.
No,
I'm
not asking you to.
Right. I have my own things that I have to contend with. Taking the log out of my own eye, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a myriad of other sins. Gossip. Okay, I know a lot of gossipers.
I'm really bad with that.
Gay men are the worst with that. So.
And I have been guilty of it as well. I will say it's not one I live in, but I've been guilty of it. But I know people who live there, but I can't. I'm just picking a random one. I can't be sitting there constantly like, this person that I know her to be, that is her thing, and I need to convince her of why that way. No, because I think God will convict her of that. Or won't, but I guess my point is, I'm not trying to change your mind, Dan, and I feel like maybe I'm wrong, but that it will be something that God puts on your heart, or it won't. And if you came to me and you said, not in a like, let's have this open discussion about what our different ideas are, which is what this is, but if you came to me, as people have, and said, I think this is wrong, but this is who I am, and I don't know what to do about it, I would direct you to a pastor. Because at that point, you're struggling with it, and you're asking for help, and I'm not equipped to help you. But I'm not trying to, like, I would never be like, oh, I can't wait till Dan comes to me and says he's struggling. I mean, when I see my gay friend, now this is something that's also gotten me, I mean, I've been called a Pharisee by another Christian, and I've been called, that I'm not loving my gay friends the right way. And I think that's bullshit also. Because one of the people who told me this, who's a self-described Christian, I think does not have God's loving heart and is a person who does sit around taking catalog of everyone else's sins.
Oh.
And I think that's a terrible way to live, and I don't think it's the way Jesus lived. And they would view me as sort of like, when I see a friend who's in love, a gay friend who's in love, I can't help but feel love for them and happiness for them, and I'm not going to treat them like poop. Why would I? I'll probably get called out for this, but I've gone to my friends' gay weddings, and I will continue to do so, and I'm not going to have anyone make me feel guilty for that. And I'm happy for my friend with that pleasure that they have on this earth. But if you sit down and say to me, do you believe that God's word is inerrant and that this is a sin? Yes, I do. Am I the person who judges whether that gay person is going to heaven or not? No. As Gothix just said, if you believe in Jesus, you are saved. And I'm not going to sit and make a judgment on that. I guess I just try to answer the questions as best I can of, if that were the situation I was in, how do I think, like, what would be happening to me? I think probably based on what I know God's done in my life, God would probably convict me on it. Maybe not. That may not be an adequate answer. Is everyone hates me on all sides now.
We're listening.
Definitely don't hate
Anyway.
you.
No, this is perfect. This is brilliant. I love having different perspectives and civil discussion about difficult issues, because I think by doing that, we're almost modeling the behavior for everyone else. And we're showing that you can have a conversation about these issues and not, result into a smashing of teeth.
I think gay, lesbian, bisexual people need more conservative values, and that it's better for them and
they need some Jesus
and for society. Even if it's not Jesus, just they need some discipline and they need to reel shit back in. And I think that's good for them and better for society as a whole. I don't think they should be celibate. I don't go as far as that. I think, like I said, loving relationships between same-sex people is a real thing, and it can happen. And I think, I'm not going to say God blesses it, but I think everything happens for a reason, and it is all part of the plan. I don't think, two people don't just fall in love and have that deep experience together and it not mean anything, on a deeper spiritual level. But, I think the promiscuity, I think the excessive drug use, I think the whole big circuit party scenes and the hedonism and all that stuff, yes, needs to be put into check. I think conservative values, or at least leaning more conservative, is something that can benefit all people, whether or not you approach it from a Christian perspective or not.
Can I jump in one more
time? Go ahead.
Just in like everyday examples of how do you navigate in the world with being a Christian and these kind of questions and with different friends, and just something popped in my head. Like I have two lesbian friends who are Christians, and I know they don't agree with me. And one is married, and we're still friends because I don't view it as my job is like to be the way that I'm friends with them is to, when I see them, be like, let's call one Julie. Hey, Julie, did you know you're living in sin and you need to get out of that? Like, how's the day going? Like, that's just like, what kind of friend is that? And it's not even at the forefront of my mind because that's not unless Julie, pseudonym, were to come to me and say, this is something I'm struggling with, I need your help with, or, let's talk about this because I don't, or I'm angry that you think this, Keri, that you think it's a sin, and this is a sticking point for me. We can't be friends anymore. That sucks. But my friend wouldn't do that. And I wouldn't have in my mind, like, I just don't think that's the way Jesus calls people to live. And I never want to be that way. This person who called me a Pharisee, I was like,
what does that mean exactly in this context?
That I speak the lies of Satan.
Oh.
And that I'm a hypocrite. And I'm living in lies. Also because I will use my trans friends' preferred pronouns if I love and respect them. And it's my choice to do so. And I understand people like my friend, and I have atheist friends who feel this way too, that you never use the preferred pronoun ever. I understand that position. It just doesn't happen to be mine. I choose when and where. Like in my personal case, like I don't, saying they, them feels like a lie. I will never say they, them. And I will never say any of the made up ones. That's a lie. It feels like a lie to me. But if I have a friend who, let's say Sarah, or someone who convincingly presents as the opposite sex, and I've only ever known them as the opposite sex anyway, and my brain automatically says one pronoun, I'm not going to force myself to say the other one. And I love my friend, and if they are not asking me, like, there's a difference between trans people who say I am this other sex, trans women are women, and then trans people who say, I know I have a mental disorder, I have gender dysphoria, I've tried everything. This is the thing that allows me to feel the least discomfort is trying to present as the opposite sex in the world.
Which is basically
that person's not making any demands of me.
That's how Sarah approaches it,
Right.
And it is a very different. I mean, Sarah even got recently temporarily banned off Twitter or suspended for a bit for saying like, hey, I have a mental disorder. That's what I have. And
they won't allow her to say it. But long story short, this person says, me calling, let's say Sarah a she, for example, that's me being a Pharisee and a hypocrite, and I guess I'm condemned to hell, but until I stop doing that. And I'm like, I don't, your way of living is not Jesus' way of living. And I could sit down and I could spend my time doing what you do and catalog the sins of other people and go to this person's idea of being a Christian is going up to you every time they see you and saying, "Hey, you're fat. That's obesity. Did you know that you're fat? Like you're living in the sin of gluttony."
Which goes back to the whole,
And
he is
yes,
he who is without sin
Or judge
cast the
not.
first stone.
exactly. And it's like, dude, do you not realize that your sin is this judgment and this gossip and this like judging the righteousness of others? And take that log out of your eye. Anyway, I'm getting angry about that.
I understand. Like, the pronoun thing is interesting because if I recall, and I think this was like a couple years ago,
It's like
but
a two sidetrack.
I think even Blair White was able to get Ben Shapiro to admit that in particular social situations, even he would use Blair's she, her pronouns because Blair, for the most part, I would say passes. I think a lot of people who, if they see Blair, they would
I would
that's
never
a biological.
say he.
Not everyone, though. I know other people who are like, "Oh, that's a dude," and I've shown Blair's picture to men before, and I ask, what do you think of her? And they'll be like, "Oh, that's a guy." So there are people who can definitely tell, but I think Blair passes very well that a lot of people would not be able to, and I think Ben just kind of had to admit that in a social situation, it would actually be kind of awkward for him to say he, him, while with Blair, and if people were around who did not know that Blair was trans, it would actually confuse them more because they were like, "Why are you calling that woman him?" So
can I just one last thing? I know they're taking up so much time, but this person actually, before we quit talking, but at first I was trying to help this person understand the way I saw, and they didn't want to understand me better. They just wanted to condemn. They rebuked me, by the way. This is the first and only time I've ever been rebuked. I rebuke you.
Wait, is that like a specific thing?
Yeah, I guess.
Oh, okay. Because in my experience, a rebuke is just where somebody like rebuts your argument.
No, it was a very formal. I am rebuking you in the name.
That's like a Christian thing.
Yes, I guess. Although I've never done that to anyone, but
okay.
It was like noted. Check that off my bingo card. Been rebuked. No. But what they in trying to explain how, just to help them better understand me, which again I failed, but it was like, what would you have me do? Because this whole thing came up because how did it come up? Oh, well, because of the my friends and photos and video interviews and people that they can see me on social media being friendly with, who I am friends with. And it was like, you're participating in a lie. Like, for example, I had my friend Suhaila on my podcast, who's trans, and she's a male to female. You would passes, you would never know. And I was trying to explain to this person, like, without saying it, without being so rude like they were being, without being so judgmental and cruel like they were being, I was trying to help them see that you can't be a stumbling block to people. How would I ever have a relationship with someone like Suhaila if and this person really wanted me to say to her or to Blair White, like, what was the name your parents gave you? Because that's what I'm going to call you. By the way, you're a man. And let's go on with the interview now. It's like, dude, there's no interview after that. And there's no friendship. And there's no that person ever coming to my church or seeing God in me.
I asked Sarah what her dead name was on the show, just out of curiosity, and that was the only thing that Sarah would not disclose. And for legal reasons. Yeah, and I respectfully just we moved on with the conversation. Yeah. But Sarah's open enough to have that discussion and to not be like, oh, clutch my pearls, how dare you ask my dead name, but I wanted to say that I do understand the perspective that some people come from, where they say you should just pull this ideology up totally from the root and not even play the game and use the pronouns at all. I get that perspective because it does feel a bit like a slippery slope, that the more we just play that game and we're nice even to people that we're friends with, we are perpetuating that ideology a bit, like I understand that side.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't think that's how Jesus would treat people.
I'm halfway. I'm halfway with you guys because my principle is like if we take Blair, for example, I've had Blair on like a roundtable discussion on my channel, and I got all the trans people to agree that they are not the sex that they're presenting as. So they're aware of that. Mm-hmm. If no one told me that Blair was a biological male, my natural instinct would be to call Blair a she.
Yeah.
So the middle ground that I find with myself is I do believe that I am normalizing lying, and so I don't want to do that. So what I do instead is just call them by their name.
Yeah.
And I'll even go as far as to say, and this is, it's kind of annoying, this whole non-binary discussion, because since high school, I've always referred to people as like them, where I'd be like, hey, Dan, they're over there, like they're hanging out, you know what I mean? And people think I'm referring to them as like a they, them. And I'm like, no, that's just how I talk.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll say that, or I'll just call them by their name to avoid perpetuating that, because I think that sort of enables that slippery slope to now you have infinite genders and you are how you feel.
I can see and respect that position totally. Maybe one day I'll be at that position too. I mean, that's the other thing I was trying to say to this person is like, this is how I'm interpreting things, and this is how I feel Christ is calling me to behave. And you know what? By the way, it was like I've had a trans friend come to my church. You know who's never going to come to church with you? A trans person, and you're never even going to have a trans friend because you're such a butthole. Like that's not the way Jesus behaves. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm done. My whole purpose in bringing up this rant and this anger about it is, I guess, hopefully to better explain how I can both believe that something is a sin and not have it impact like how I behave or feel about or treat a person, because there's a myriad of sins. And I know this is the one that, because it is different, Dan, as you've pointed out, it is about who you are and who you love. It's not about like my drinking. I can quit that, even though I did love the bottle. I loved it, but it was like different. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Well, the bottle's not a being that you're bonding with, and that's what makes it different.
I think there's an important point I think we should mention is that sin, especially this is one of the things Peterson brings up, you know, the definition of sin, it really sort of means to miss. Like you're aiming at something, but you miss the mark. You don't quite hit it bullseye. And, you know, we have this sin as a word. It has this heavy Christian Catholic connotation, and we sort of think of it as evil behavior. But if we think of it as behavior that isn't optimized instead of it being evil, or behavior that doesn't necessarily benefit the individual or the whole societal organism, we sort of strip it of that emotional, moralistic connotation. I think we can talk about it in a much more scientific or accurate way that doesn't necessarily burden people with, you know, that emotional reaction. So that's kind of how I like to think of sin. I think of it as missing the mark. And that way you could say, yes, homosexuality is a sin, because ideally, you know, everyone would be in procreative unions with the opposite sex. But, you know, so you can't have it. You miss that, you know, you end up gay. Sure, it's a sin. You're missing the mark. The other thing I wanted to talk about, Vanessa, you brought up that phrase where it was talking about like in the flesh versus in the spirit. And I found it really fascinating because Dan and I have studied these different systems of esoteric sort of different systems. And one of them is by this guy, Carlos Castaneda. And Castaneda talks about this thing called the predator's mind, which is basically like the devil on your shoulder that sort of whispers like, you know, id type things like, oh yeah, you want to have more sex, or oh yeah, you want to hit that bottle, or oh yeah, you can do that. It's totally fine. Don't worry about it. It's not going to be a problem. That is kind of what I think of when I heard you mention like being in the flesh. You are so your conscience or your decision-making apparatus is hijacked by your instinctual drives, and you aren't rarefying it through the spirit, which should be your higher level functions that let you sort of rein that shit in and think, you know, more with like a future, like into the future, like, okay, well, if I do this too much, you know, into the future, it's going to be bad. Which that I think of that more as being like in the spirit. So it was an interesting, that's kind of what popped into my head when you were talking about that phrase.
Yeah, or, you know, like what Gurdjieff refers to as mechanicalness, being mechanical, like allowing all these outside forces to pull you this way and that way, but not really knowing the true self, which would be like the higher self, or the self that is closer to God. And like as animalistic as humans are, we are still human, and being human means that we have the capacity to not be that, to rise above our animalistic tendencies. And just because those tendencies are there does not mean that's necessarily what we should be following.
Normal and natural, but not
Yeah.
necessarily good.
Not necessarily good. So
My husband has been watching a lot of videos about or reading about the ego versus the soul. And I think that in the way that I think it's talking about the same thing in a way. I think it's the flesh versus the spirit. And I've also heard Christians, recently I heard a Christian refer to the flesh as like my Adam nature, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it. But
Adamic versus pre-Adamic man. This is the idea of man before the fall and man after the fall. And then after the fall, we sort of ate from the tree of good and evil, and we learned all the things, and all of a sudden we had choice, whereas before we didn't really know, and so we were a little bit more innocent. It's like they say pre-Adamic man was, more naturally good, and then post-Adamic man, we're all embroiled in sin because it's now pushing us each way.
So I guess the last topic that we'll touch on before we, wrap this up, we'll probably have like 20 more minutes to do this, is I did want to talk about gay marriage and, what you guys think about that. And are you, hung up on the word marriage? I know a lot of Christians, that's kind of where...
I don't like it personally.
Yeah, and there are even gay men who don't. Me, I don't see as much of a problem as using the word marriage, and I'm going to get into that why, but what do you think about this whole gay marriage debate? Do you think same-sex couples should have the right to form unions with one another and be, have the same legal protections and rights and those sorts of things?
If we're looking at it as like legalities and having the same like rights, I think that that's one conversation, and sure, but I think calling it a marriage is where I draw the line, because that's something entirely different from how God defines marriage. And by the way, I used to be on the total opposite side of this conversation too.
Yeah.
Like all of these topics.
Yes.
It was one of the main reasons why I never bothered to look into Christianity or Jesus. It's because like they hate the gays, and and so it is a little bit odd for me to be saying this. But yeah.
Well, that's part of the reason we invited you guys on, because we know you have that sort of dual perspective.
New Christians, I like it.
yeah, same. As I said before, my flesh, my human inclination is not to believe that it's a sin. Like my human nature is like, I've been on the opposite side of this conversation, like you, and I actually agree with you. Legally, yes, gay couples should have all the same rights. I'm not so hung up about what Caesar calls it, like what we legally call it. I actually don't really care. I think God says the one spirit union is intended to be between a man and a woman. And I also think, I failed to say this earlier, but I think all these things about ways to live, and you mentioned this sort of with missing the mark. I used to think of all these things as restrictions, and just like from a hateful authoritarian God, like when I wasn't a Christian, I looked at it that way. And now I view them as guidelines for, this is how you're going to have the optimal life. This is the way I've intended things to be, because I love you. And so it's like, I kind of losing my train of thought there.
It goes back to what I said in
yeah.
regards to discipline. Like, there's value in discipline. There's value in putting off immediate pleasure right now and sacrificing that for something in the future that is going to be better for you.
It's also kind of like what Gothix was saying with it being a... oh, wait, my brain just totally fired.
Did you just brain fart?
Bleh.
Keri,
No, she
Keri
said,
has it. She
Gothix
put it
said
in the air.
She said something. It was totally appropriate. Oh, well.
It was good, I promise.
It was good. It was Gothix. It was amazing. So you want to share? You want me to
I
pull this
wanted to
up?
bring up this video by a Twitter mutual I have. He's like more like a libertarian, right, sort of conservative young man. His name is Luke. He has a channel called Freedom Analysis, and he did I thought was a really good rebuttal to Matt Walsh's argument as to why gay marriage can't exist. And so I wanted to, sort of watch some of this with you guys, like the last 6 minutes, and then we can, talk about it, because I think his argument is kind of solid, at least in regards to answering Matt Walsh and how he's defining marriage in this kind of more strict way.
Do you want to give a brief summary of what Matt Walsh said about it
So basically he said, he sticks with the whole typical marriage is only between a man and a woman, but even more so, he goes on to define it as that gay marriage can't exist because marriage is only with the intention of procreating, and that is the main end goal of it, and that his marriage is not the same as, what the hell's his name they were talking about?
Pete Buttigieg.
Pete Buttigieg and his, because
Jason.
Pete Buttigieg and his husband
Jason
can't make life. And Matt is saying, my relationship with me and my wife, we can make life, and that is a huge difference. Therefore, my marriage can exist and yours can't. So yeah, let's just play the video.
What exactly traditional marriage is. And no, your answer cannot be, traditional marriage is between a man and a woman. What is it that you are saying is between a man and a woman? What is it? What is the purpose of it? Besides sexes, who can and can't get married, what other factors come into play? Because it turns out that we have been redefining marriage for a very long time. Marriage in the West is indeed not traditional marriage. In fact, the very concept that marriage is something you do with someone you love is a relatively recent redefinition of marriage in history. It turns out that marriage has not always been leave it to beaver up until the gays could get married in the 21st century. Stop arguing redefinition of marriage as if that alone is somehow a negative thing when you have accepted, consciously or not, that redefinitions of marriage can be a very positive thing.
And the idea for thousands of years is that marriage by definition is an in principle procreative union between a man and a woman. And it serves as the foundation of the family, which serves as the foundation of human society. That was the answer. That was the definition. That's what it was.
I think you're leaving some things out, like it being a family-arranged union with the sole purpose of forming familial alliances, an institution in which husbands can beat their wives, widows being forced to marry their brother-in-laws, whether or not he's already married, and the opportunity to stone a bride if she turns out not to be a virgin. Yay. But then, of course, the libs had to come in and change the whole thing to be a lifelong commitment between a couple that loves each other, not dependent on having children, where both people are equal standing. Also, did I mention both parties, as in monogamous? All I'm saying is go ahead and Google how many wives King David had. It turns out that marriage has not only been redefined as to what it means and what it is, but also has been redefined to who can and can't get married. It's actually thanks to redefinitions of marriage that we allow interracial marriage and we don't allow child brides or polygamous marriages. And that really makes that whole conservative scare about gay marriage in 2015 seem pretty ironic, doesn't it?
He says, well, my marriage deserves to be treated equal to other marriages. Well, but equal means the same.
Equal does not mean the same, but okay.
Is it the same? Is your relationship with Chasen, is it the same as, is it in principle, in its substance, in its function, is it the same as my relationship with my wife? And the answer is no, because my relationship with my wife has the potential to create new human beings.
Damn! Cattiness levels are at a critical 100%. We've apparently got a fruitful, sperm-carrying, heterosexual male here. You know, actually thinking about it, Matt Walsh is kind of a dill. Yeah, no, I'm just kidding there. But not really. But can we just take a second to think about what this would sound like if the people Matt Walsh was directing this towards were different?
Is your relationship with
your barren wife,
is it the same as, is it in principle, in its substance, in its function, is it the same as my relationship with my wife? And the answer is no, because my relationship with my wife has the potential to create new human beings, and yours doesn't. So that is a difference.
By that logic alone, Matt, a barren/infertile marriage is just as meaningless and non-existent as a same-sex marriage. I hope you realize that. I love how traditionalists will try to argue that gay marriage equals kids when they can then argue that gay marriage affects more than the two people who get married. But then all of a sudden, gay marriage does not equal kids when traditionalists try to argue that the whole point of marriage is having kids, and that since two penises or two vaginas can't make a baby, then that makes same-sex marriage pointless and therefore, not a real marriage.
It's almost like you can't win.
Is it an important difference? Is it a definitional difference? I would say absolutely it is.
May I state again that you just argued that a barren marriage is invalid by definition, but okay. Honestly, what was this? I was expecting an in-depth explanation on why gay marriage can't exist, and all I got was just 6 minutes of two bananas can't make a baby. Checkmate, homos.
Really quick. So what is he referencing when he says all of this? Like, because the debate about marriage, I don't think it's something that we're all going to be able to agree upon. Because if my standard for marriage is what God defines as marriage, then someone following culture or someone citing how marriage is viewed in different cultures outside of the United States, it's like you're never going to have an agreement on it. So I think we all need to understand where that standard is coming from.
Well, what he seems to be saying is that we have redefined marriage multiple times in the West, in the United States, on many occasions. That
So basically, Matt Walsh was making the argument that redefining marriage is just another redefinition, like we've seen the left do with everything,
Right.
which I think we can agree is bad, and that marriage should, at its core, be a procreative union between a man and a woman.
Yeah. So
Is he
Those are
calling that
Walsh's arguments.
tradition? So Matt Walsh is defending something he's calling traditional marriage rather than than Christian
but
marriage.
his definition of it is very rigid, and this is where Luke here really kind of, I think, has a good rebuttal to him, because Matt is defining a marriage is between two people who can make a life, which not only discounts same-sex marriages, but also discounts barren marriages between heterosexual couples, because there are many couples who simply can't have kids together. So by Matt's definition, those marriages are also not considered legitimate. And it's a huge hole in his argument in the way he's defining this in this very rigid way. Clearly marriage isn't just something that's supposed to result in kids, and you can't use that as the sole way to define it, because again, there are many heterosexual couples who can't have kids. And I think that is a big hole in Matt's argument, and I think it's a legitimate criticism. And then, the different ways he talks about how it was defined in the past is like, marriage used to just be this arranged thing to form alliances. There are all these things that used to be permitted in marriages, and how you treated women and that sort of thing. Child brides was a thing that used to be allowed, and we
Still is in some parts of the country.
Still is in some parts of the country, and we redefined it to exclude that. Interracial marriage, that used to be not viewed as a proper marriage. That wasn't traditional. You were supposed to stay insular within your culture and within your race. And again, that was very normal in the United States for a long time until we redefined the concept. So
What do you ladies think? What is marriage?
So, I love your narrating, by the way. But since I didn't see the actual video, it sounds like Matt is trying to argue how marriage is defined outside of a biblical context, perhaps. Which I think if you do that, inevitably you're going to end up in this situation where you look all over the world, you're going to have different standards for what is tradition and what is marriage. So I think it would have been better for him just to argue from the biblical perspective, because then at least you have a starting point. Because otherwise, if we're just going to argue that, well, marriage has always been redefined and traditional has always been redefined, well, great. Now little boys think that they can be girls and get their pee-pee chopped off and everything. You know what I mean?
So this was Brent's rebuttal earlier earlier to this, but the difference is there. We're talking about something that is a biological reality and a fact, not something that is a conceptual thing. Marriage is a conceptual thing. And he's not looking around the world. He's talking about things that were normal here in the United States and in Europe, in the West, and how that changed over time. So we have redefined marriage multiple times throughout our history.
Yeah, but I would also say that, okay, the term marriage, again, you have to start from a standard, because we can even, and I'm sure maybe Walt has even commented on this, like if he says, well, what is a woman, right? How are we defining what the definition of that is? Well, if I believe in God, then God defines what a woman is. And just because a certain culture takes that and skews it for their particular belief system, it doesn't negate that the original intention for a woman would be a biological female. Same thing with marriage.
What do you think, Keri?
Oh, I was looking for this verse to read to you, but because I don't, that's why I asked about traditional, is he defending traditional marriage or Christian marriage? Because I don't care about defending traditional marriage. Like, traditions change, and there's been all kinds of traditions, and they could change
some
again.
good, some bad.
But in terms of like, if this were about like, well, what is Christian marriage? God made man and woman to be one flesh union, to come together as a whole. And there was a verse I was looking for where he gives different roles to the man and the woman in the relationship. And it was this one here. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the savior. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. And actually, this, I don't know why this one had a ... and they cut out a relevant part about the wife. It says, the wife is to submit to the husband. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so the wives should submit to their husbands in everything. And then there's another verse about wives, obey your husbands. And I think that because I'm a woman in my marriage, I am called to let my husband lead, and that I am called to obey. Now, that doesn't mean obey something that's against God's will, or to allow myself to be pulled into something evil, or to allow myself to be the victim of abuse, or anything like that. It just means if things are functioning as they're supposed to in this yin and yang, and my husband is loving me the way that Christ loves the church, then I should obey my husband. Uh-oh. Did I lose you?
No, I just Raid's barking.
Radar was making noise.
Anyway.
No, I think that's a good way to think about it. And, it's very controversial to say, that the woman should submit to the man's leadership in the relationship.
I know. That's something else for people.
All the second wave feminists are going to be like, bah!
I know a lot of friends as I'm saying this who will not like this, but that's okay. That's just what I think. And I have to learn how to let them do that. Just like with dancing, I have to stop leading.
Somebody has to lead. And, the other thing I thought was interesting is that the way that they talked about it, the man, was described as sacrificing himself the same way that Christ sacrificed himself for, his flock, or the wider Christianity, the church. The man is the one who will go into battle and defend, who dies first.
The protector,
the provider, he's charged with making the sacrifices so that, mom and the next generation can continue and live on.
Yeah.
I feel like that's some sort of wisdom that we've lost I think
it's a wisdom that should apply to all men, including gay men, including men who can't be in a relationship with a woman. We are still supposed to be protectors. I don't think we're supposed to give up our manliness or our masculinity. Perhaps how we protect is different, and we serve a different role in the family, but we are still supposed to protect our families, protect people in our community, protect our friends, protect children, right? And it's why I love groups like Gays Against Groomers. I think it's great to see all these homosexual people coming together and trying to protect children and to push back against this ideology that is harming them. I think that's a very masculine thing. Even though some of them are quite feminine, I think you can be feminine in your mannerisms perhaps, but there's something about your demeanor, your spirit, that has that masculine urge to protect, to defend, to speak out, to stand your ground.
Yeah. I had another thought, but again, look, ever since I had the coop, I've had this like, is this, I don't know. I feel like this is one of the things I'm living with now. I'm like,
Oh, you have
Stay hydrated.
You have long
brain
COVID.
fog. Yes.
Every time Gothix takes a drink, I'm like, I think of what was it, Melanie Mack? She was on your show, and
She was dehydrated.
She was dehydrated. Yes, and now every time it's like, stay hydrated.
Stay hydrated.
Poor Melanie.
Like Gothix has that huge thing of water over there.
Yeah, I've been fasting for 2 weeks, so I've been eating mostly vegetables. But it's good because like I'm rewiring my body because usually I don't drink this much water, it's just coffee.
Oh yeah,
that's
I have
good.
my coffee.
A fast
with
is
this.
Your
so
skin
helpful.
is so glowy with the
Oh,
fast.
thank you. I swear it's a filter. It's a filter.
I just
Sweet
want to
kid.
say thank you to you guys for having us both on to talk about this. And, you know, I'm in a couple of social justice groups online just because I like to see what they're up to, especially one in my hometown. And they have a lot of these groups called Courageous Conversations. And it's such nonsense. There's no conversation happening and there's certainly no courage. But this is a real conversation. And where you come into it knowing you're going to disagree and to such a degree that, you know, I might hurt my friend's feelings or my friend may not feel the same way about me afterwards. And, or I might not feel the same way about my friend afterwards.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I just appreciate you being willing to have that conversation with me.
We appreciate both of you coming on, and we knew how you felt about the subject before inviting you on. I don't think there was anything new that was revealed in that regard. No, I mean, I don't think so at all. You know, in regards to the question of do I struggle with it, with being gay and wanting to act on that? Yeah, of course I do. You know, I do want to be a good person and a good Christian. I do want to feel like that I'm behaving in the right way that's not bad for society or bad for me. But at the same time, I don't want to live a life of loneliness and isolation. And I definitely don't want to feel like whatever bond I share with another person is inherently bad or evil, even though it could be that, and it could very well fall into that sort of thing. And perhaps it's easier for it to become that amongst gay and lesbian people when there is no mediating force like children and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, it is something I struggle with.
And see, I don't have that experience. I hate to use social justice words, but it's not my lived experience.
It's not my lived experience.
Like people should, it's like something that people need to listen to Christians who are gay talk about, no matter how they fall on this, like where they fall on this question and what their opinions are about it. Because it's like, if I'm talking to someone who's struggling with alcohol, it's much easier for me to have that conversation with them because it's been my struggle. And I can tell them, look, this may not be true for everyone, but I know I feel like this is true and this is the way to go because this worked for me. And I can give that real like experience. And I wouldn't go to someone who's never struggled with alcohol for that advice. I just wouldn't, because they don't have that. They don't know what it's like to be in love with a bottle.
That's true.
Yeah, and I mean, Dan and I have different experiences. We broke up, by the way, for everybody out there.
Oh my God,
just just
I'm gonna throw that out
I just
there.
want to throw that. People are wondering.
That's common knowledge now. I would
Okay, well,
think.
now it's common knowledge, so I just want to throw it out there.
Is this
But
the
anyway,
announcement?
It's
Is this the
probably
announcement?
talk about on the show. We don't know everything we're going to talk about on the show, but I figured now it's been so much time, I might as well just throw it out there. So that
I threw it out in the chat in Mikey's last live stream, and he was like, oh,
yeah,
I had no idea.
People didn't
I'm
know,
just like,
so just throwing it out there. Anyway, I've had a lot more sex than Daniel. I've had a lot more debauchery. I've had experiences that I would not describe on the air to audiences, including you fine ladies, because they are so vulgar. But it's not something I'm interested in anymore. You know, it's not like a lot of people go through that process to varying degrees as they age. You know, so normally it used to be like just, you know, we used to call it the wild oats. Like, you know, men would go and sow their wild oats, and then they would mature, in theory anyway, and settle down and, you know, have a family, raise kids, that kind of thing.
But many gay men never leave that life.
They don't, because we don't have to necessarily. There's not that social pressure. And now there's even this social celebration of that lifestyle. And childlessness even is being encouraged as being a green choice. And it's just like... so anti-human.
Part of what I've struggled with is that I've always found it very difficult to fit in with other gay men because I did not have that experience. I didn't go through the slut phase. That it just wasn't a thing. And I internalized a lot of my Catholic values. And even as someone who was gay, I tried to approach all my relationships in that way. You know, I didn't cheat. I didn't go sleep around with people. My first long-term relationship lasted 5 years. You know, I was in with 2 other guys before Brent, and then my relationship with Brent lasted 7 years. You know, and that's unusual. It makes you a unicorn amongst gay men. And for a while over the last year, up until maybe the last 3 months, 3 months ago, I kind of came to terms with it. Like, no, there's nothing wrong with me. But for a little while, I started to wonder if there was something wrong with me, that maybe I didn't grow up in certain ways and develop because I didn't have that experience. And this is why I can't relate to other gay people. And you know, it took a good friend of mine to kind of help me realize that, no, there is nothing wrong with me. Actually, it's probably better that I was able to practice that discipline and didn't just give myself away to all of these different people willy-nilly. And, you know, maybe I've preserved more of myself in doing that and not having those experiences.
So I was saying something to my pastor at the end of our the last service, where I went to such a place of darkness before I found God, or turned to God. And I sometimes recognize that in friends who come to me for help, like atheist friends or what have you, because I'm like, I know that dark place, I was there. Yeah. And in my case, it required that because I was so stubborn that God had to strip everything away from me before I finally took the opportunity he'd been offering me over and over and over again just to see him. I couldn't see him until there was nothing else. And I really had to learn, like, I was on a podcast last night where they were talking about, as a child, telling your child not to touch the hot stove sometimes doesn't work, and the child has to touch the hot stove. Yes. I had to touch the hot stove so many times just to learn what was hot and what was bad for me. Yeah. I'm sorry.
No,
and anyway.
No, that's a great analogy.
The point being, not everyone has to do that, Dan. And I truly believe that hedonism and licentiousness and stuff. Look, I've learned from all of my sins. I have. They've all meant something. They all had to happen because they've led me to where I am now. But my pastor was saying, you know, some people don't have to do all that. They don't have to go through all that.
I knew for a while, at least I felt I knew, until I had that bit of an identity crisis later, you know, at 32, where I felt just so different. I didn't fit in. But before all that, you know, I was pretty certain in my life choices that it was better for me to not throw myself into that, just because I did see how it affected other people, and I didn't feel it was a healthy thing to do. So I avoided it at all costs. You know, I wanted to be in devoted relationships. I felt better in a relationship. I didn't want to just sleep around with random people. I didn't think there would be benefit to me.
It's so much work. Oh my gosh.
So like Keri says, I didn't have to touch the hot stove because I saw other people touching it, and I saw them getting burned, and I saw what it was doing to them. And I knew very early, very young, that wasn't the path for me. Plus, you know, my grandma instilled a lot of more modest values in me. And, you know, even though when I was younger, I was a little more liberally and lefty, I was probably more economically lefty, but I was always a little more socially conservative, and maybe I've become a little more liberal conservative over time, just in being more accepting of people and understanding that they have different experiences. They had to touch the hot stove. I didn't have to touch the hot stove. You know, Brent had to touch the hot stove. I didn't. So it is what it is. But I had a while there where I started to question my decisions and whether or not that was right for me. Like, did I stop myself from growing up in certain ways? And it's like, no, you know, I don't think I did. I I think perhaps I did make the better choice, and I didn't have to do all of that stuff to realize that it was not going to be good for me.
At first, when you started talking about this, that you hadn't gone through your slutty phase, I thought you were going to say you're in your slutty phase now.
No.
And,
No.
and what I was going to say about that, and didn't end up going there, but if anyone watching is in a place, I think, where you're like, you have something that you are being convicted about, perhaps, and you're struggling with it. And this has happened to me multiple times now with different struggles where it's like, okay, I'm in this struggle. And I just remember that prayer of Augustine where he's like, Lord, make me pure of heart, but just not quite yet. Because he's like not ready. Like he really wants it, but he's not. And that was my thing with alcohol.
Yeah.
Like I wanted to leave, but not really. I didn't. I was like, just give me a little more time with this guy.
Yeah, that was me with that was me with weed, you know, and we spoke with Gothix about this on the last episode she was on, and she understands because she went through the same sort of thing. It's like, you know, you can overindulge in something to the point where like you will just justify it over and over again in your head that you're not doing that it's not an overindulgence. Hey, I'm functioning, I'm still getting this done and that done, not realizing all these other effects it could have on you, and you lie to yourself. You know, you tell yourself these lies to continue the behavior when there is something deep down in you that knows that like I'm abusing this.
Yeah.
And sex is the same way. And there are lots of people, you know, who will make all sorts of justifications in their head as to why they can be that way and that it's not actually hurting them. And maybe they truly do feel that way. But I personally think that they're lying to themselves, that it doesn't take a toll, that there isn't a price they're paying. And I think there is a price you pay on your soul for that.
I paid it. Woo!
Brent's paid it. You learned, right? You touched the hot stove.
I mean, I
like,
learned. So now I feel like I will probably be more like voluntarily celibate, just because I don't have. So I had for much of my 20s this little fucking demon on my shoulder that was like, you need to go screw, like get out there, go do it, come on. And it was literally like a hunger. Like I would get hungry for sex, and it was a regular extreme drive that I can't describe to people that haven't experienced it. It was very strong. And it finally chilled out in my 30s, my early 30s. It sort of calmed down. And that was actually about when I met Daniel, and we've been together for 7 years. And so in that process, I've also sort of like more mellowed in terms of my libido. And so it's not there anymore. I don't have that. I mean, it's still there, but it's not screaming in my ear, demanding attention like it was in my 20s, and I can just ignore it.
Mine is like mellowing because now I'm like in my 30s. It's particularly bad in the summer, though. I find the hot months are
Testosterone and androgens will drive men to mate, and that's their biological imperative.
Also, like working out more on that sort of thing.
Working out, fasting will also cause men to boost their human growth hormone and testosterone levels naturally.
Right.
Which is really cool. I'm glad that you decided to fast. It's one of the most healthiest things that you can do. It's really good at getting like toxins out and just resetting the whole system.
Yeah. But and you know, it's one thing to know though, and I think it's important to know that those biological, instinctual things are there. And it's one thing to know, and another thing to just like follow it completely and to not question of just because it's there doesn't mean it's correct.
Yeah. And some people will go through that and, you know, come out the other side and hopefully not end up with any sort of lifelong illness or complication. I know a lot of gay men that, you know, ended up with HIV, that ended up with other diseases, that ended up traumatized because they chose the wrong partners who abused them psychologically, physically,
or
emotionally.
they're not able to actually connect with anyone else on a deep level. And I know heterosexual people go through this too when they just view sex in that way, but like they're looking for connection, they want that deeply, but they've compartmentalized sex into this sort of like a transactional sports kind of activity, and they don't see that there is a connection between that and actually deeply bonding with someone and trying to find what they actually want.
A lot of times they call it play.
Yeah.
In the gay community or in the kink community, they call it play.
Whereas I just don't view it that way. I don't think sex is something that's just play. I know you can view it that way. I don't think that that's the smart or healthy way to view it that way. I take it very serious. It's a serious thing. It's the most vulnerable thing you can do is to share yourself in that way with another person. Yes, you're bonding with them. And, you know, my whole argument this entire time is that, like, gay men are capable of that. Maybe they're less likely to do that, though. And that's perhaps why we shouldn't try to totally normalize everyone to go in that direction. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It doesn't mean that we haven't had deep spiritual sacred bonds between two men or
maybe
two
we
women.
should figure out ways to culturally enforce
these ideas.
You know,
I'm not going to
homosexual community.
I'm not going to hold my breath. Like, you know, we were talking to Basil about this on our live stream. Like, I'm not going to hold my breath and expect that we're going to change the norm in the gay community. I think that's probably not possible.
Who knows? A lot can change in 20 years.
Sure.
I mean, look where we were and look where we've come.
But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't at least try to promote some more disciplined, conservative type of values and behavior to people who are homosexual. So hopefully they can find ways to try to reel that in, to practice discipline, to keep it more to themselves and not do it all out on the street or try to teach it to kids in schools and to just live their lives, right? And to try to live good, disciplined lives as gay people the best they can, you know, without it affecting society and making everyone into, like, I don't know, bunch of whores.
I think it's a great place to sort of wrap it up. Ladies, you want to give your final thoughts or anything else you want to share?
Should have just ended it right there. That's it.
No, we gotta have a last comment from our esteemed guest.
Yeah. So remind you can give your last statements or whatever, and
we'll do that after.
Remind everyone where they can find you on the internet.
Okay.
Yes, you can find me at Gothix TV on YouTube, on Twitter, on all the places. Find me. Yeah.
Fun.
You can find me on YouTube and Twitters and all the places. Deprogrammed, Real Keri Smith.
We'll
I don't know.
Links in the description.
Yeah, put links in the description. I was trying to think. You said final words. I don't really have any final words, although at one point I was thinking at the end that the next crazy, uncomfortable conversation might be to have a conversation with you guys about casting out demons. I've been reading these books lately, which everyone thinks I'm crazy, but I'm like, this guy Derek Prince about demon, about possession and stuff, and thinking about sins that one is plagued with, like alcoholism, for example, as being a demon rather than anyway, this is what I'm reading now. So if you're ever going to do that, I'm game. Let me read a little more first, but
go for it. Yeah, no, I've gone down the demonic possession spirit attachment rabbit hole. And there is a difference between a demonic possession, which is a non-human malevolent entity that attaches itself to a human and slowly begins to, puppet them and do all sorts of craziness. And you get the real extreme, like symptoms that have been described in like movies and stuff about possessions. Those things do happen. Malachi Martin wrote about them. He was a
hostage to the devil.
Hostage to the Devil is the name of the book. And I really don't recommend like neophytes or people that are psychologically unstable. That is not a book for them. This is really only for somebody who has gotten into a place where they are psychologically stable in life and are seriously investigating these topics, because it can cause further instability in somebody who's unstable. And there's also spirit attachment is this idea that human spirits or souls that get trapped on the earth plane and they don't actually cross over into heaven. They get trapped here and they can glom on to people and they can cause physical symptoms and psychological symptoms. So and then there's actually an interesting connection between alcoholism and spirit attachment. And there's actually, they used to call alcohol spirits, and that was for.
We could also, when we have this conversation more in depth, we can talk about the connection between these topics and the alien UFO phenomenon, which Brent and I believe there is a connection between those two. So that's something we can dive into. For sure. And we have a lot of books that we'll recommend in regards to that stuff. But we would love to have that conversation with you. Like talk about the weird paranormal, metaphysical stuff.
Demons are so interesting to talk about. Oh my God.
Ladies, thank you so much for speaking with us. We appreciate you guys a lot. We consider you guys very dear friends. Gothix. I hope we can meet in person one day. We've already hung out with Keri before, which was great. Keri stayed with us last summer. That was fun. And maybe we could all get together and hang out at some point too. That'd be awesome.
Fun.
Yes.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you guys. Good to talk to you.
Everyone,
Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks for watching. Remember, like, comment, share, subscribe.
Subscribe to Gothix and Keri.
Go to their channels, donate if you want to help us continue doing this, and we'll be back very soon with another episode.
All right.